Hello, everybody online. Hey, everybody here. My name is Joel Gerlach, and it's an honor again to come to you guys. I mean, Blender I started using in 2003, so it's amazing to see how far it's come, how big the community has grown, and I never would imagine I'd be able to even be here. I'm still nerding out every time I get to talk to you guys here on WBMD. So today we're talking about kind of 360 VR content. So last year at this time, we did a presentation about how we took a project for Lego and turned it into kind of this whole 360 video experience. And so we're back with another project, which I'm going to talk about. And so oh wait, I have to start my timer. There's so much to talk about, and I would love to get into really the nitty-gritty details of everything, but I'm going to try and keep it broad, and then so we can have time for questions at the end. So real quick summary of who we are. So we're Studio 229. We were formerly a VFX house. We did VFX using Blender for about 3.5 years. And then about a year and a half ago, we transitioned into fully VR. And now we've been doing VR solid, commercial projects, original content, the whole thing. We're actually quite busy. It's been a really amazing year for us to really develop our VR portfolio. So we use cloud-based artists. So we have a core team of people here in Los Angeles, and then we like to hire people all around the world, specifically Blender users with our cloud pipeline. Blender is our core. It always will be. We'll continue to use it probably until we die. So that's always a core component of our company. And people who come in from other platforms are like, hey, come and learn Blender. And they're like, oh, this is so much better. And we're like, we know. That's why we use it. So we've done a bunch of different work for big clients. And now we're actually, we've transitioned from just passive 360 content into games. And so we're developing not only for our 360 pipeline, but also video games, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So real quick summary of Lego, the Arctic Survivor VR experience is our first big 360 project. Contained both a framed video, so a traditional, watch it in a 16:9 aspect ratio, and then a 360 video that accompanied the original sequence. It really stretched our rendering capabilities. In our tests, we had some scenes that were 500 million vertices, which was comprised of all the Lego bricks all running in a dynamic particle system. It was pretty crazy. We rendered out just 2K mono. We did it. We had kind of a side part of our company was developing, so it took 3 people 6 months from start to finish to do the whole thing. And people really loved the reactions were really positive for people to see kind of Lego in VR. It was the first time Lego had been fully immersive in that way. And it became our new calling card for people to kind of check us out and see what we did. And ironically, it's still not released to the public, which is like, okay. This is a slide from last year. It's still 487 million verts in the scene. It was pretty crazy. And then here you can see this is an example of the unwrapped, the equirectangular frames from this project. But that brings us to this recent project that we did. So we were approached by a company called The Secret Location. They're based here in LA, and they do big VR projects. And so they had a music video that was being sponsored by Oculus for a EDM artist named Morgan Page. And so they came to us and said, hey, we really like your guys' work. We want you to do this. And so when they handed us the pitch deck, it was some really difficult scenes. It was all set in a forest, so there's going to require all the forest geometry. There was going to be a character that was made out of stone and rock that had to move and come to life. There's going to be these ribbons of cloth energy that would surround the character and shoot out into the forest. Or a lightning bolt would start a fire, and then the whole forest would catch on fire. And then the forest, after burning, would peel away the ash, revealing this new, fresh, white world underneath. And that was a pitch deck that they sent to us. And, the other thing, they wanted to do multi-camera viewpoints so that you could trigger a different viewpoint at any time and be able to see it from all the different streams. So we looked at that, and instead of saying no and running for our lives, we said, yeah, why not? This sounds like a lot of fun. And it was originally a 1-month turnaround time, and we knew some things were going to have to give and pull, which is absolutely crazy. They wanted to try and have it done for the Oculus convention that they have in San Francisco. But our deadline ended up getting extended, so we were able to take it in a much better direction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, about the project. So the first thing was really discovering the art style. They loved the style of Limbo, which is like a game which is very kind of flat and gray, but also has a lot of dynamic. And they originally wanted everything to be black and white. And so we kind of came into the struggle of, well, is it realistic? Is it stylized? How do we go? We knew that simplistic shapes would be tricky to communicate kind of what was going on. But when they extended the deadline, that opened up new possibilities for us to be able to take it into a much more realistic direction. And we ended up with near photorealism, and we're actually not sure how that happened. It was never a conscious decision. We just kind of all of a sudden realized that all our work was getting photorealistic. And I was like, well, okay, I guess this is what's going to happen. And the client, of course, they really loved it. So you can see here, this is the original thing. We're like, oh, we'll hit kind of right down the middle. And by the time we were done, we were around over here. So you can see this is some screenshots from the work. So one of the things at Cobalt, got to mention, Cobalt is my business partner. He's our lead art director. He was supposed to be here this morning, but he couldn't make it. So I'm the one stuck talking about all the art stuff. So one thing that he did, which is actually really clever, is instead of building an entire scene and trying to get everything all set up for that whole scene, he started first with a small chunk. It was a little piece of ground with some rocks and trees and these orbs, which we'll talk about later. And he would just go in and update just those assets and start to swap them out with new things, start to build better materials. Instead of having to do a huge render, he was able to just focus on this small piece. So that ended up being an easy way for us to iterate and to see, hey, how is the style developing over time? As well as the landscape itself and all of the forest was generated using the same way that we did the Lego project, which was we created a base landscape and then we used a particle system with dupli objects to start to populate the forest as we built it. And it allowed us, using linked assets, we were able to really easily swap out trees to different models as we went along. So we didn't have to rebuild or kind of author the forest. So this is one of our first renders that came out within the first couple days of working on this. We literally just took the mist pass straight out of Blender. We would invert it so the sky would be black and the foreground would be white. But this kind of showed, we first showed our clients like, hey, do you like this? Is this kind of something that you want, this kind of misty world? And they said, yeah, we love this. Keep going with it. So then we started to experiment a little bit after kind of going that direction, and our deadline got extended to say, well, what if we actually started to add in some shading, started to add in lights, different pieces that would give us kind of a more interesting, more kind of realistic look as we went along. And that ended up turning into, well, okay, maybe we should actually really start to light this thing and really start to increase the number of objects, increase the number of the detail inside of all the trees. And you can see here, this is kind of funny, these trees were kind of a temporary thing, and they kind of look like evergreen mixed with palm fronds. They're not really like any tree that currently exists. But ironically, this tree base ended up making it all the way to the final video. We just textured them, so we kind of have very odd-looking trees in this video. Then continuing to push it forward, you can see we're really starting to add in things. We started using HDRI lighting. We started adding in things like moss and different textures on the rocks. It was great. We could use the normals that the rocks and the trees and the bushes were generating to lay moss over the top using materials, so we didn't even have to hand paint them in. It just knew whatever's facing up, add moss to it. And that eventually ended up pushing us into much more dense foliage, ferns and trees and rocks, and really just starting to populate this whole thing out. That led into us now starting to add, which you can see as soon as it loads the next slide here, where we actually started to add in puddles of water and rain, and now everything became to have a glistening look to it, like everything had just fresh rained, which actually we had then ended up adding in rain at the beginning, until we ended up with really what would be our final kind of look here, which is this kind of dark and moody and mysterious forest with a lot of ground fog kind of here along the side, and then kind of realistic rocks and textures. So we started in stylized and simplistic shapes, and then we pushed ourselves all the way up to this, and that obviously didn't happen overnight. It took us quite a few months to get to this thing. So art style, there's a lot of really talented artists here, so I want to talk a little bit beyond the art style and go into the camera. So what you're seeing here is kind of the initial storyboards that were given to us, is kind of what they wanted to have happen in each scene. But the problem with these types of storyboards and the fact that they're framed is that it's hard to take something like this and convert it to 360. So you can see there's a lot of really dynamic angles here, different close-ups farther away. But when you convert to 360, when the view is available in any direction, that introduces problems that are hard to storyboard for. Another thing that that we found out is that the cuts have to be slower. You have to give the viewer enough time to be able to look around and absorb what they're seeing. Whereas an EDM music video, which is like doom, 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 you usually want quick cuts, which you would see normally. But for us, we had to kind of slow things down and spread it out a bit more. Another thing is you have to have minimal movement of the camera, or you introduce motion sickness, because a person gets the illusion of moving without the sensation of movement, and then that introduces the feeling of nausea that often comes in VR. So we had to figure out how we can actually get the camera to be in interesting positions and feel dynamic without moving it in crazy directions. And then, of course, focusing the viewer. If somebody can look in any direction, but you need them to focus on something, how do you get them to pay attention? And of course, that means that what works in a framed video doesn't work here. So the animatics that we were originally putting out, the storyboarded temp sequences, they're tough to convey. And we also knew the client's expectations on our first renders would be for interesting things in all directions. And that's really hard to just be like, bam, interesting things in all directions. You have to really plan it and work with it. So we really had to go in a process of discovering what would work and what wouldn't. For Lego, we just used static cameras, and there's just one camera the entire time in one position. But here, this is, instead of a minute-long video, this is going to be a 3-minute video. So we really had to come up with different things. Different ways to make the camera interesting. So we identified key camera locations, and we figured for our first pass, we'll just put 6 cameras out there in kind of cool spots, and we'll just cut between them, and that's all we'll do. And so we rendered out still frames into of the 360 sequence with title cards to help us figure out what's going on. And then we knew that these still renders had to kind of formulate our video, because otherwise, if we were trying to render out 2 minutes and 45 seconds of equirectangular 2K video for starters, that would just been a lot of render time, a lot of costs. So we had to use still images at first. So then, of course, the clients were like, hey, we can't really see motion. Everything looks flat and still. We really want you to make the camera move. So then we're like, okay, let's do this. We'll render it on an OpenGL. And so far yet, I know Delay was kind of talking about this a while ago, but it would be nice to have a OpenGL equirectangular. I don't know how the math would work. But instead what we did is we just made the field of view as wide as possible, and we rendered out these frames to kind of simulate what you would be looking at to catch the action. So you can see here, this is one of our first temporary animatics flying through the forest, seeing all these different pieces. And we experimented with a lot of motion, and that's what the client was like, always have the camera moving. The camera should never stay still. Just keep that thing going. So we're like, okay, we'll make it move. But then when we took those cameras out of what looked really good for the framed video, when we took them and rendered them out in 360 later on, the cameras were moving way too fast. When you're actually watching it inside of your VR goggles, all of us, you're just being slung around, which is what we were really worried about. And motion sickness kind of became a key component for our clients to realize, okay, yeah, we should tone this down. We should have subtle movements that always give the viewer the sense of motion without increasing motion sickness. So you can actually see here, we're translating pretty far distances over the course of this forest scene. So after you'd work with that, then our initial cameras got locked, and we're like, all right, let's focus on the next major stages. So there was one character in this video. They called her the mother, and she would be the key voice of the video. She was supposed to be made completely out of stone and rock, like a statue, but also able to move. She needed to seem ancient and otherworldly, yet kind of feminine proportions and features. They didn't want her to feel scary. They kind of wanted her to feel, a little bit mysterious. And so we knew that in order to kind of accomplish all those things, we would have to have a high level of detail in her, a more high level of detail in her than we would in the environment. Because when we did bring the camera up close, you wanted to be able to see all the details on her face. So we set out to make this mother character. So Kale, who is our amazing lead animator, he came in and he was really talented at doing these sketches really quickly. So he actually put these sketches together of this character based off of the references that Cobalt had made. And this now became the new foundation for creating what would be this kind of the full version of this character. Which now you can see kind of here in these orthographics. And the big thing that was always a key part of her was plates, and to have these plates that would be able to move as she bent, and to kind of feel that she's made up of many different pieces of rock kind of all put together. So we set out to make the character. We needed this. I love this slide. We needed something temporary as a placeholder to put in there. And so this ended up being our kind of, I called her Mario because she has a big nose and a mustache is what it looks like to me. There were supposed to be rocks, like on her body, but fortunately this is nowhere near where we ended up. Yes, murdered and stuffed. Yeah, very, very buried in snow and slightly puffed up. So Daniel, we hired Daniel Peterson. He's an amazing Blender artist. He came on board specifically to start with the character, and he stuck around, and we made him do a lot more than that. But he kind of sculpted this all out in Blender. This was kind of his first pass that we then made notes on to basically take that the concept art and turn it into this reality. So the next thing was we only were going to model from her torso up. She wouldn't need legs. She wasn't moving. She was kind of always pinned. So this became kind of her dress in a sense, was these pile of rocks. So Daniel sculpted out all these rocks in Blender. And then on the other side, you can see this is after Cobalt got it and was able to add in the materials and all the different dressings that would kind of formulate the area of her base. So this is the final sculpt. Daniel went in and also created a full rig for it, everything that would give full articulation from the facial features all the way to the fingertips. And you can see here, this is her in her starting position. So we would later go in and actually bury her in rocks that would then be just animated as rigid bodies, and they'd kind of dump and move around as she moved to be able to push it, do physics simulations on them. And then this is her in kind of her ending position, this triumphant kind of final pose that indicates that she broke free of kind of the mold that was given to us by the client. And you can see here, this is another initial rough test on the texture pass on her to be able to give her that sense of rock and moss that she was made out of. And then the client wanted her to have kind of an undulating energy that would be underneath her, revealed at all times. And so this was kind of a test version of what it would look like to add in these underlying emissive values. And what's cool is that these textures would move as she moved. So it kind of felt like there was this energy that was underneath her. So she started out rock, and then over time, she would begin to glow. So when it came to animation, the question was, how do you rig and animate a rock statue, right? Like, the statues, of course, don't move. So how do we convey the fact that she was made of rock, but also still trying to give her that feminine approach? So we had an amazing animator named Adam Clark, who's based here in LA. This was his first Blender project, which is awesome. He picked it up so quickly and really loved being able to work in the animation tools that Blender had. So the motion for her had to be feminine and graceful, also powerful. And the key component of this was that she had to feel like she was struggling to break out of the rocks. And then the rest of her motion would be smooth up until the triumphant ending. Pacing was really important for us. She needed to kind of have these big sweeping moves. Everything in the video actually takes place in kind of semi-slow motion. And so all of her motions had to be animated with this very slow kind of outward reveal over time, except for one part where she finally breaks free and all the rocks go flying off. So Adam had to take basically about 3 minutes of video and to be able to tell a story in slow motion for her. And the ending result was really good. I'm totally biased. Okay, so effects. Effects in this project were the kind of thing that we hoped, we kind of kept setting it to the side and not paying attention to it, hoping that somehow it would magically resolve itself without us having to do anything. That, of course, did not happen. And so we were stuck having to figure out really a lot of effects. And one of the biggest problems that we faced, two main problems, is one is that it's 360 video. So unlike when we would do VFX and you could just kind of get your temporary effects, it only had to work in this zone. All our effects had to be visible from all angles at any time. And the other problem was that we had the multi-cameras that they still wanted to do. So that meant that all the effects had to work at any location at any time. So we couldn't just kind of throw these pieces together in comp. They actually had to work in the Beauty Pass in Blender. And so we actually packed out, I put down here poor Blender, because literally all our effects were brought in as linked assets, and we're able to run in kind of real time-ish to kind of showcase or to be able to allow us to render them at any time. So we had these ribbons that were connecting to the character and flowing out through the forest, which meant they had to be cloth. They had to animate like cloth. They had to feel cloth-like, except they were made out of energy. There would be these energy orbs that would float up from the ground and start glowing and then fly into the ribbons and attach themselves to the ribbons. Also really crazy for us to figure out how to get that done. The whole freaking forest had to peel away to white. And that was the big one. It was like, how in the world are we going to get a forest to peel away? And then there was like some small stuff like rain, ash, and a lightning bolt. So I'm going to break down the effects for you guys real quick. This video that you'll see here is one of the test renders of the orbs being able to lift up and kind of come in towards the ribbons. So you'll see them here. Quick breakdown. So we simulated the cloth, these huge, giant forest-sized pieces of cloth with weights at each tip, and we would move those weights around and allow the cloth to kind of flow and move very slowly. And then there's one moment where she pulls taut all the cloth. And so then we had to basically stretch the weights out, these anchor points, so that the cloth became taut. As soon as we got all those dynamics done, we had to bake the cloth to an MDD file. Then we imported that MDD file to an unanimated cloth mesh. Then we added a particle system with no physics or animation to the cloth. And then we used keyed particles to move the orbs from their initial particle system, which allowed them to float up off the ground, and then flew into where the ribbon particle system was, to blend between those two particle systems, basically. And we had to do that 6 times for each major section, because if you just did one keyed particle, all the orbs moved at the same time, but we had to have the feeling that some were moving before or faster than or different than others. So then we pulled our hair out, because keyed particle systems are still pretty messy in Blender, and we had to hack them together. It was a mess. Then we used an animated material for the cloth to wipe on at the beginning to make it seem like the cloth was stretching out into the forest, when in reality it was always there, it just was being wiped on. And then we had to get therapy when it was all done, because it was a pretty difficult thing for us to do. The next thing was the peeling effects. So we had Daniel working on these. I'll show you guys a couple of quick tests that we did over time. So you guys start somewhere. Here's just a sphere with the cloth ripping and kind of tearing off of it. And this is kind of our initial test. We're like, all right, maybe we can do this. The next thing was these tree pieces here that you can see the particle cloth pieces are being kind of torn off the side and kind of pushed forward with some glitches there. And then finally here is actually the full forest mesh kind of being broken and pushed in these particle systems. And to get to this point, I mean, we're talking about like hours and hours and hours of baking and simulating, and something's broken, so you got to redo it. It was really difficult. I definitely would have gone back in time and said, say yes to everything but the peeling. That's just too much. So we ended up actually getting a pretty clever workaround. I'll try and describe it real quick. This was my idea. I literally was desperate, and I was like, let's just try something stupid. So I created the particle plow. And this is basically here a big piece of mesh, and then this one here that was a wave. And we broke out all of the geometry into a particle system. And we set those to be dynamic, but only dynamic upon collision. So the particles were there all the time. And then this big plow would basically come through and start pushing all of the particles forward. The ones down here near the camera is right here where this light is, so you can see how tall this thing is. But they would scoop up the particles and fling them forward to make it seem like the world was kind of peeling away and pushing. And then we created a material that was based only on the particle's velocity. So it would be fully transparent when the particles weren't moving, and then become opaque as soon as they started moving. So that way it made it look like the particles were peeling right off of the forest as they got pushed. Because trying to do simulations on the whole forest would have taken probably a few years for it to finally complete. And also, this is only 1% of the particles that were displayed here. You can see, I know that the mesh is included here in this count. There's 127,000 verts in here, but by the time we were done, and each piece of the particle was a randomly chosen static mesh. And those, when it was all done, it was like it was a lot. It was a lot to do, because the client was like, we want to see all the effects. So here is like an initial first test of the peeling effect. You can see inside of the forest. You'll see it start to come up over here. I know the compression is pretty bad. But you'll see, this is before we toned it down. You can see this massive wave of particles just flinging by the camera and kind of peeling and then pushing beyond the camera. Another key component of this, which was really difficult, was that the particle wall would be the forerunner of the white world that would be underneath. So we had to create something that we're pretty proud of, and we called it Global Mist, or G-Mist. And what we needed was, we needed a way to be able to take the black world, the nighttime world that was kind of what the viewer had seen so far, and have the particle layers peel away into this white world, a new world that comes after the ash. And so the only way that we could really do it realistically was to have 2 separate passes, one in day and one in night, and then use the G-Mist pass to wipe between it. And basically, if you guys are familiar with the mist pass in Blender, it's basically the distance from the camera outwards to a set point. And everything that's close to the camera is rendered black, and everything far from the camera is rendered white. And so we needed to be able to take that not from where the camera was, because the camera was going to move to different positions during the course of the transition. But what we needed was a world-based location for us to do our wipe. So we created a material that used global coordinates and gave them a value. So each individual pixel on the forest had a specific value, somewhere between 0 and 1, which then we could use a threshold to animate between the two passes and use the particles over the top of it to kind of be the forerunner. And so I'll show you a quick version of this. Oh, well, these are final frames. So you can see here, there's this white world that's underneath and behind the camera, behind the viewer. And this was created by thresholding that GMIS pass all the way down to just that specific area. And then here's another one. This is later on when the camera passed by. You can see the particles are now receding from us. But what was great is that with this method, we could put a camera anywhere. If the client required us to change it, we didn't have to go back into our missed passes and retry and try and get it to work and all that stuff. It just worked, period, regardless of wherever the camera was, which is really great. Real quick, we'd add our comp passes, pretty standard. We heavily used our ambient occlusion pass and then our beauty, which was combined of all the different passes upward in Blender with the specular and diffusion and all that stuff. We had a background forest layer. So the forest, there's a couple drone shots where you're really high up looking out at the whole vista of the forest, and to try and render a huge distance of all, full resolution models would have taken a long time, and we couldn't really get the LOD system, to the level detail system in Blender, working quite right. So we ended up rendering out all the trees as sprites, and we created a particle system and just threw it way out there. And those, of course, rendered much quickly, and we just composited that in the background. We had a background sky version, our emit pass for all the glow, and then our Z depth and our mist pass just for standard mist compositing. So you can see here, this is an early test, early in the production process, where you can see some of the ribbons. We just used scaling back then to get them to animate outwards before we'd figured it out. So you can see here we've got the different passes, the rain that's on top, the mist that's kind of in the back. Here you can see this is back when the orbs were all moving as one keyed particle system. And we started to set the foundation of here's how the camera would move. The clouds were moving way too fast. We had to slow those way down. This kind of gave an indication of how we were going to basically approach the policy. Oh, low system resources. That's okay. We'll move on. So finally, it came down to render everything. So we plugged render streets really heavily last year. We were going to plug them again. They literally saved us so much. Just knowing that they were there and available for us by the time we knew we had the render was great. We were in constant communication with Marius there. He's an amazing guy. So the specs of this was equirectangular 360 4K stereo at 30 frames a second. We actually up-res later to 6K, but rendering it at 6K would have been incredibly expensive. Originally we would have loved to have done 60 frames a second, because that's kind of the standard, but it would have been too cost prohibitive to double everything. And then of course stereo, we had our left eye and our right eye. So cycles, we used 150 samples on average. We really worked hard to make sure our materials were running as clean and efficiently as possible. Our material nodes were crazy. They were just a huge thing to be able to cut down on the noise and save on render costs. So much thanks to Delay for getting the spherical stereo built into Blender. That helped us be able to actually render out stereo images in 360 without getting a lot of problems with the crossing of the eyes when you looked at the poles on the top and the bottom. So a couple statistics for you guys. It took 420 server days of rendering. So one computer, it would have taken 420 days, one powerful computer, 420 days to render the whole thing out. It completed in about 3 to 4 days from start to finish. They had up to 250 servers running simultaneously. This is actually relatively low for the total server count, but they were able to optimize the servers to maximize efficiency. They could have bumped it up to 1,000 servers, but then we would have paid for all those 1,000 servers. So they actually were working around the clock to help us be able to optimize the right server time, so we didn't get pegged with a massive fee. The longest frame was 10 hours, not too bad, but it did obviously take quite a long time. It was 3.5 terabytes in total size of all the frames and passes, so we had to have really high bandwidth from their servers to ours to be able to get all these files down and get them out in time. It cost us about $10,000 in final render costs. I'm always really curious to see, nobody really talks about how much things cost to render, so this is about how much it cost us. It would have been a lot more if these guys hadn't have spent all the time, the render street guys hadn't to spend all the time to optimize for us, so they really saved us. And then constant support from them. They were amazing. So on the launch, the secret location and the client, Morgan Page and Oculus, all really loved it. They're really excited about it. So they put it up as the front page on the Oculus store. It's still on the front page right now, actually. It's available for the Gear VR on the Oculus store, and it's released on Facebook 360. And one of the cool things is that they allowed us to kind of fill out our credit form at the end, which so the credits that's in the app as well as on the Facebook video. And we really wanted to honor Blender, so we put created using Blender down there. And that was really important for us, for everybody to be able to see that, hey, if, this video was created using, free open source software, which I know somebody may look at that and be like, wow, I want to give it a try. So I have the link here for the actual video. I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'll wrap it up. So real quick, Studio 229 in the future. So after doing all these 360 projects, we actually did another one that's releasing soon for YouTube, YouTube Red, but we can't talk about it because it's not out yet. So that was another big project that was running simultaneously with this one. We did that in using Blender as well. So while in that time we were like, man, this is really stressful. Let's try doing some real-time stuff. This will be really nice. I don't have to worry about crazy rendering times and all that stuff. So now we're using Blender and Unreal Engine 4. We're actually just about to release a VR game to Steam, probably in the next week or two. And you can see here some pictures from it. So all these assets and pieces were built in Blender and then brought into Unreal Engine 4. So we've got other 360 projects that are releasing soon. Really excited about that. And then we're still pushing 360 content for Blender. I mean, Blender is still so far ahead of all the other software packages in terms of ease of use. Like literally, you can render 360 videos by pressing 2 buttons in Blender. That's all you have to do with Maya and Max and some of those other software suites. You have to have plugins and you have to have a render pipeline and all that sort of stuff. So really want to encourage people to at least give it a try, because VR right now is a great and a really exciting market. And with a software that's so easy to be able to do it, we want to encourage people just go out there and give it a try. A shameless plug, if you're interested in joining our team, we love hiring Blender people. They're hardworking, they're talented, they're willing to get the work done. And so we really love supporting this community and trying to give back on any way that we can. What's the next slide? Oh, yeah. So in the middle of this project, my first daughter was born. Her name is Olivia. And so I had to leave the team in good hands and be like, see you guys, have fun with all the peeling effects. I'm out, and take care of this little baby. But then I came back to help finish that. So thanks for your time. I don't have time to view or to show you guys the video. I want to make sure for the other presenters, but you can see it. It's actually here on Facebook. You can just search for Morgan Page 360 video. And they've got, you basically can play and watch it from your phone. Oh, well, you couldn't see it. So anyways, that's our time. I know there's not time for questions, but you can always email us or get in contact at our website, and I'd love to answer anybody's questions there. So that's it. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.